what I'd like to ask you to do is to, there's a table captain, I think, at every table. If there isn't one assigned that you can tell, then someone volunteer to. I'd like to have representatives to our keynote, the thoughts that your table's represented. Every table doesn't have to contribute. I mean, if someone else has said a similar thing, then we only have time for about 15 minutes here of Q&A. So I invite you to form a line here from your table. One representative from the table, if you have something to say, to please come up and ask a question of our keynote. Because of the time, where I'm going to ask that you restrict your comments to just concise summaries, and then if you have a question, one question per table or two at the most, just to stimulate a conversation between the keynote and the audience. So please come up. The mic is here on the floor to my right, and as you seek to have something to say, you're welcome to come up and present, please. And I'll ask our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Naughton, to come up too.
So my name is Sam. We believe that part of this leadership is relational and getting to know each other. So we spend 80% of our time introducing one another so we could work together. So, and I think I don't apologize for that at all. Good people here, so that's a treat. So, but what we did talk about at the very end was a concern, and I'm not quite sure how it fit your questions either, but the incredible concentration of farming in the United States today. In the last decade, there's about 200,000 farmers that produce 80% of everything that's produced in the United States. That's a concern for us. So how do you bring young people back in? It's a big business. It costs a lot, the values of land. So that's where we went first with our group. Don't have answers to that question, but we have a lot of concerns I think that we each share. Is that okay, team? Very good. Okay, thank you.
Just to very quick comment on it, it does seem to me that a process like this, if you can start to prioritize what you see as significant challenges you want to deal with, it could be very helpful. And what we had to do is kind of make the best that we could to say, we think these are the critical questions we want to focus in on. Again, in a document like this, you can't deal with everything. And so this idea of a discernment, what do you think are some of the key questions you want to address is simply part of the work of how to see reality. So that's a great comment. So thank you very much.
I'm Father Gregory Mastio. I represent table number 3, and you guys must have been listening in on us too. We started building relationship too right away to find out what farms and how we react with our comments, so they're not just comments, but related to the relationships that we have with our own agriculture. So we talked a lot about looking at the picture from the big ag and being very specialized in one commodity and farming lots of land, to the other reality of small farms, with looking at it at a more broader sense, and then having more in relationship with lots of different areas. So we talked about what the complexity is of that, and then how does faith then, is faith really the part that we're rooted in that tries to balance both sides out instead of trying to get rid of both sides or one side? So we kind of talked about that in our group of, it's not one is evil and the other one's good, but rather how do we look at both and say, is faith the component that we throw in there and says it balances both sides out? And so those are the kind of questions we were talking about at our table.
That's very helpful. And it actually was an issue that we often had in the vocation of the business leader. I remember we were talking in the Catholic tradition, when you speak about the purpose of the business, there's a phrase they often use of a community of persons. How do you develop the idea of a community of persons within this institution we call business? And a lot of people said you can't have a community of persons in large multinational publicly traded corporations. And we actually had one of the CEOs who have a large multinational corporation says, yes, you can. Now, it's challenging, and there's all sorts of issues you have to deal with, particularly if you have outside investors, and particularly if they're hyperactive, and particularly if they are, particularly have great influence on that corporation. But we also have to realize that there are great challenges in small family startups. So you're exactly right, Father. I think one has to get a clear sight that there's challenges everywhere you go. Thank you.
We still have one question which sort of speaks to what we discussed, and that is, how does one prudentially decide which agricultural acts are moral, immoral, with the competing goods of both legitimate profit and a respect for nature?
Yeah, right. One of the, I simply don't know the answer to that question, but it does seem to me that this question of the tensions of the goods is an important thing. Again, I would say certainly from a Christian perspective, leaders of institutions have to be able to articulate clearly the institutional goods of that which they're responsible for. And when they do that, they recognize that one of the dangers or challenges of leadership is that these goods are always in tension with each other. Frank Schwinn, we have for those of you from America know about Schwinn bicycle. For those of you who are not, Schwinn was a major bicycle manufacturing. Frank Schwinn back in the 50s said this. He said, being in trouble and being in business is the same thing. The day you're out of trouble is the day you're out of business, right? That is, you're constantly always dealing with the tensions and the troubles of how those goods are constantly interacting. The danger of the leader is they get fixated on one good or two and they exclude the third. And once they do that, to alleviate the tension, then you have a whole series of things that the document actually calls idolatry. So, thank you.
I'm Deborah Savage. I teach at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity, and I'm representing Table 11. And Senor Vincente was very clear that I should come up and ask this question. I think that's what he said. So we went through the questions kind of carefully, and in response to the first one, I guess that would summarize most of our conversation. We wanted to say that we keyed in on your distinction, Dr. Naughton, between being good and being careful. And it seemed to us that being good meant I could go full speed ahead, that I wouldn't have to worry about those ditches because no matter what I'm doing, I'm sort of empowered, right, by the fact that I'm focused on the good. And that Christians, that what they are. My experience in business revealed to me that actually the best thing to do is to always tell the truth. You won't get fired. At least that was my experience. People threatened me with it, but it never really happened. So, but you have to be right. And so the first principle of see first makes a lot of sense, because if you can see reality objectively, then you can actually state what is so, and then it's pretty hard to fire you. Yeah. Then we realized that we actually do know, when we came to judge, we actually do know what the good is that agriculture does, and that is, in a sense, good food, safe food for everyone, right? That would be the thing to pursue. And we came to this discussion of what are the necessary actions, and we realized we actually knew a lot of what needs to be done. There's a list of things that one could do, but the question that came up is, what actually gets in the way of getting those things done? You can't really blame it all on business. It's not always greedy businessmen give away. Just like Senator Klobuchar's example of the woman in Ethiopia, who, when she was there in Ethiopia anyway, there was a field that was unplanted. So how do you get to the point where people can actually sustain their own agriculture in their own countries? Yeah. So the question we wanted to ask was, what gets in the way ultimately of simply doing it?
That's great, and again, I hope the conference will start to uncover and examine those types of things. And again, I think many of you are in a far better position to know what those obstacles are, because they are there. We live in a fallen world, and we have to recognize that fallen world is going to provide those obstacles. Thank you, Deborah.
I'm Mike Callicrate, Table 5. I'm in the livestock and meat business. Happy to be here. We jumped right in. It talked about the white water and businesses always in trouble. That certainly has described agriculture, with the 1 million farmers we've lost in the last 30 years and the 500,000 ranchers that have left the land in the last 20 or 30 years. But we jumped right into the corporate power thing. the abusive market power of big corporations. I think around our table we pretty much agreed that that is a real serious problem, and not so sure it's one that's easily dealt with. One of our participants at the table talked about how do we deal with this really abusive corporate power. In fact, in an environment today where there's a lack of regulation, there's a lack actually of law enforcement, and in fact, it was said we're in an environment where the biggest cheater wins. How do we fix that? How do we fix that? And so one of the participants said, well, with corporations, you can either regulate it, you can convert them, or you can subvert them. Well, I'm kind of in the subvert category. I've kind of got tired of some of the other options, but anyway, our question might be: is it even reasonable to expect that we can have peace and justice and good food for all without really addressing this corporate power? Thank you.
Again, a very large topic, but obviously from a Christian perspective, like such challenges, one should never lose hope. Hope is a theological virtue, that there's always these possibilities. But obviously you have to understand the fundamental challenges that go along with it. The question would be, you mentioned subvert, but it'd also be interesting about dialogue. I know there are some people from large corporations sitting here in this organization. Can the dialogue foster understanding about what the problems really are? But thanks for your comments. Appreciate it.
Good afternoon. I'm Jason Adkins from the Minnesota Catholic Conference. It's great to be with you, and I'm here representing Table 1 and our discussion. We talked a lot about the economic pressures that many farmers are facing, from small farms to big farms, the need to simply survive, help feed their families, preserve their farms. Sustainable agriculture has to be sustained by income. For example, there are many pressures that are fueling consolidation and other such things, and people feel the really strong need to simply preserve the bottom line, to do for myself good goods, but also good wealth as well. So the question would be that we struggled with is, how might the logic of gift, for example, help farmers see their agricultural property in its social dimension? In other words, how might we balance individual property rights with more communitarian concerns as well?
It's a great question, Jason. Obviously, the deep structure of all these things and everything that we're talking about is that there's a deep social structure that goes along with Aquinas' notion of property. Is that property, when we understand property as simply private property, Augustine, for example, would often talk about private often means privation. And so the question is property just simply an asset that one owns for one's own interest, or is there a social dimension to it? But that goes not only for property, but it also goes for one's work and for the goods that one produces. So I do think you're right, the idea of the social nature of these things. And the document, the vocation of the business leader addresses some of those questions, because we often don't think about the social nature of property, the social nature of work. The whole idea of the Christian or Catholic social tradition is an attempt to try to illuminate this social nature of what we're talking about in a world that tends to be highly individualistic. So, great question. Thank you.
Stephen Reed, Shepherd's Way Farms, representing Table 10. We started our discussion talking about the role of farmers as producers, and as one of the few industries that has never really controlled the cost of their inputs or the price they get paid for their outputs. So you're kind of victimized on both ends. And the title agricultural leader doesn't just encompass us in the middle, it encompasses those other entities and how do we manage those relationships and what is fair or not fair. Ultimately, we move to talking about the non-monetary benefits of farming, kind of in the context of your business leaders talking about financialization, globalization, and as a farmer, every day is an act of faith, every day. Yet when you're sitting down with your banker, there's no value that you can monetize that faith with the banker. There's no value that they're going to assign to the social value that you bring to husbanding your animals, to stewarding your land. But those are the central components of what we perceive as a good farmer, but without any value. So ultimately, the question becomes, how do we carry that value, monetize that value in a sense for the other agricultural leaders that aren't tied to the land?
That is a really great question, and I hope you will have lots of time to discuss it. That's a great point, particularly in a market economy that doesn't really take seriously, as you say, these non-economic values, at least in that way. So thank you very much. Adam, great to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Hi, I'm Adam Kay. I'm the Director of Environmental Science here at St. Thomas, and I'm the representative from Table 9. And we also didn't follow directions very well, or we spent our time introducing ourselves for most of it. But it was interesting during that process. One, I realized that we have quite different perspectives, and it was interesting to see the potential interplay between these perspectives. And two, there was a central theme to what we discuss, and that was the trade-offs that agriculture is facing. And we discussed these from our different perspectives, and one was from a global perspective, thinking about the trade-offs between the need for growing more food and the need to reduce environmental impacts, and how intractable that trade-off might seem. And then we also discussed it from various perspectives, for instance, talking about the trade-offs between providing workers with fair wages and at the same time keeping agricultural goods cheap and affordable, or talking about trade-offs in California between expanding land use for oil drilling and fracking versus agricultural production, or creating situations where workers have a dignified experience but can still produce food for the market. So I guess if I was going to phrase a question is, how do we solve all those trade-offs?
Easy. Well, it's great, really great one. Again, I would say the key thing, you could think about it as trade-offs, and then it simply becomes a matter of negotiations. And there's some part of that, and you will often get that there's basically a conflict of interest. And it seems to me that type of way of framing it might eventually fall into kind of a stalemate. And the question is, can you reframe it? And again, I don't want to put everything on the three goods that I mentioned up there, but really what you're talking about are goods. Now, we live in a consumer culture that tends to benefit the customer, and thus we get as many products as we want at the lowest price we can. And they, in a sense, tends to punish the producer because we live in a consumer culture. And so sometimes the larger culture is kind of already predicting or leaning toward that. But I wonder whether if the conversation, again, I do think the reality is we live in a fallen world, and sometimes we will have trade-offs and we'll have to deal with those trade-offs. But what if we talked about it in terms of goods, and the question, is there a way of, and again, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, is there a way of finding a way that these goods, in a sense, are complementary to each other? Again, not a great answer, Adam, but nonetheless a great question, so thank you. Brian, great to see you again. Thank you.
So I'm Brian Bademan, and I'm from Table 2 up here. I work at the University of Minnesota at a Christian Study Center, and so my comment here maybe reflects that station that I'm in. But across the university, I mean, the university is kind of secularized space, but I would judge or see, not sure which it would be, that the agricultural space there, and there's lots of different departments and schools, is maybe one of the more sort of open to God, if I can put it that way. In terms of certainly the business school or the some of the sciences, and so I wonder this is a question for us maybe to consider, just what is the nature of the secularization of agriculture and reflection on the environment. And I think that getting a handle on the character of that secularized discourse or the way that those industries have secularized might help us in a strategy. So
Great insight. I think you're absolutely right. And again, obviously, in the secular world, there's much to learn, there's much to garner, but a secular world that is constantly marginalizing this larger theological space can have significant implications to it, and particularly in a technological world. Because if it's simply about techne, if it's simply about technique, this becomes a very cold world. So let me end with a quote on this question of vocation that comes from a man named John Henry Newman, who's been a very great inspirational leader in the program that we have here at Catholic Studies. And Newman puts it this way, and this stained glass is right here on our campus. Actually, if you look out that window, you'll see that stained glass in our library. And Newman says this: God created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it fully in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary to his purposes. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. It seems to me Newman's notion, and particularly of the religious and spiritual meaning of life, and our destiny, our choices are the prime indicators of the destiny that we are doing. And from an eschatological perspective, a theological perspective, we become eternally what we have given ourselves to. And what the vocation of the business leader, and I hope the vocation of the agricultural leader can do, is that it can help people start to see God's purposes in the work that they do. Because it seems to me, as Benedict put it, this is the widest conceptual map on which people can discern their work and its meaning. And it seems to me that it's desperately needed in the world that we have today. Really enjoyed being here, and looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Naughton. That was really helpful. This is a great start to our symposium.